Okay, let's start.
Problem.
All right. Okay. All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to one of our monthly webinars. Thank you for taking your time to join our live webinar tonight. We hope everyone is staying safe and during this difficult and ongoing COVID situation, no matter where you are. As some of you who are regular participants of our monthly webinars, you may know who I am. For those who are new, my name is Grace, and I overlook all the exciting things that happen at Benq, including our webinar sessions. I will be your co-host this evening with our main star, Ian. And for those who have joined our initial webinar with Ian a few months ago, he's back for another great informative session. And for those that don't know Ian, he is a multi-award winning commercial photographer based in Melbourne, Australia. He specializes in advertising, aerial, fashion, food, corporate people, public relations, portraiture, product and industrial photography. He first opened his studio, Altered Images Photography, back in 1986. And he is also an accredited professional photographer and a member of the Australian Institute of Professional Photography. Ian has in recent decades accumulated numerous industry awards and titles. He deals with advertising agencies, design studios and clients direct, and his specialties include advertising photography, aerial, architectural, commercial, corporate portrait photography and fashion, food, industrial and product photography. He also has a large format archival fine art printing, which you can find more details in the chat as we've provided a link to his website. And going through the agenda today, Ian will focus on the raw workflow and along with his tips and tricks for processing your raw files. As per other webinars, feel free to ask any questions throughout the session and we'll get back to you at the end during our Q&A. There will also be a quick survey once the webinar finishes. If you could please provide some of your feedback, that would be greatly appreciated and would also help us for future webinars. Now it's just over to Ian.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for logging on tonight. I hope you're all keeping well during this lockdown. It's very stressful. I heard today in Victoria that today marks 6 months of lockdown for us if you add all the days together, but we're still plodding along and trying to stay positive. And it's good that you're joining us and hopefully you'll get some positive information from me tonight. Raw processing is pretty much the only way I've ever worked in digital photography. And I struggled in the early days trying to explain people the value of working using a raw format. So I'm going to go through a bit of a presentation first tonight and explain to you the benefits of shooting in RAW. And then I've got some files there where we can demonstrate how we would go through and work a file for different scenarios and different outputs. But we'll get to that. So first thing I'll do is I'll just flick over to my keynote presentation. So just bear with me. It's going to be a bit clunky because I'm going to just share my screen so that I can chop and change into other programs. So first thing we will do is I will start with this one. Are you able to see that all right, Grace?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay, good. All right, so as you know, my name's Ian van der Wolde, and tonight we're talking about the RAW workflow and tips and tricks for processing your RAW files. I'm going to go through a fairly standard RAW workflow. The RAW processing software does vary from program to program, but the essential tools are pretty much included in all of the software. So irrespective of what software you're using, you should be able to get something from tonight. So we'll go through, first of all, I'll just skim through this because Grace has pretty much explained all of that. I opened my studio in 1986, and I've been running consistently since then as a full-time photographer. I have shot many weddings. I think I've shot over 500 weddings, many portraits. But in 2000, I decided to really focus on my commercial work, which is what I actually graduated from at college in 1984. So just some quick samples of the sort of stuff I do. I do everything from machinery, outboard motors, a bit of industrial work, some aerial work. As Grace has already said, some interior stuff. That was for a bathroom company. I photograph people, from corporate headshots to television commercials to graduate programs. What's going on here? Sorry, I've got... What's going on? Something's come up on my screen. Hopefully that'll... Just bear with me. It's locked up on me. Hang on a sec. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on. I've got this screen happening and I don't know how to get out of it. Just bear with me for a sec. I'm just going to escape this program. I don't know what I've done here. Grace, are you able to unshare me by any chance from there?
Yeah, let me have a look.
Oh, hang on, I can do it from here. I'm just going to log out and then log in again.
Okay, sure.
I have no idea what's going on here. Okay. Right, well, just bear with me. I'm just going to stop. Okay, I'm just going to get out of there. I'm really sorry, everyone. I have no idea what I just did then. I dragged something down and all of a sudden she wasn't working. All right, I'm ready to share again if that's okay, Grace.
Yep, ready when you are.
Okay, so... All right. So I apologise for that. I must have dragged something out of the Zoom menu and it sort of locked me out. So I'll keep going. So photograph for brochures. I do product photography and food photography. So this is all stuff that I've done as a paid gig. And then I love to shoot for myself. So I'm a big fan of black and white and in particular long exposure photography. But that's not what you've come to talk about. But that's just to give you a bit of background. So I've been shooting digitally since 2000. So it's 21 years this year. So it has become second nature for me, even though right through college there was no digital cameras. It was all...
your screen is only showing half.
Yeah, no, it's only showing what?
Half the screen.
Half the screen. That's bizarre. Top or bottom?
Left.
Left. Okay.
So we can only see the right side of your screen, but only projected the left side on our Zoom.
All right, this is bizarre. What about now?
Still the same. And it's stuck on the ANZ graduate.
Okay, so I'm going to get out of here. what I might do, I don't know what's going on here. I'm just going to quit Keynote altogether. What have you got now? What can you see now?
The same. Someone mentioned if you've got two monitors, you need to ensure you've got.
No, I'm only working on one monitor today, so I'm going to stop sharing again.
Mirror mode.
Okay, so what's happened now?
Now we can just see you.
You just see me. Okay, look, I'm sorry for this, everybody. Let's see if we can take off where we open that again. I told you it was a jinx, Grace, when everything was going so smoothly during practice.
You shouldn't have mentioned it.
I should have kept my mouth shut. All right, so I'm going to share again. Can you see it now?
Yes, so we see everything and we see the slides on the side as well as thumbnails.
Okay, good. And I'll just move that down. Look, I'm sorry, everyone. And hopefully we're back into full screen. Have we got full screen now?
Yes, we do have full screen. But we're still stuck on the AEST page.
Yeah, no, that's obviously it locked up and that's where it was stuck. Change now?
Yes, to fries.
Okay, so, all right, just quickly through. So we shoot product, or I shoot product and food. I'll just scroll through very quickly or we'll run out of time. So when Grace said earlier that I specialise in all of these fields, I probably would suggest it's probably better to say that I generalise because I do pretty much everything. These last images is my personal work. For those that were on our last seminar, you would have seen all of those. But like I said, we're here to talk about the raw workflow. So what is RAW? Now, I'm not sure at what level the attendees are, but I'm going to go through the basics of RAW, hopefully to give you an understanding of what it is and why we're shooting RAW. I teach at Swinburne Uni here in Melbourne, and I've had some comments from some students come back, and I really need to explain to them the process of shooting RAW because a lot of them don't get the full benefit of the file, of that extra data, when shooting in RAW. So we'll go through that so that you really get the best out of your RAW file. So all cameras, even your smartphones, shoot in RAW. However, most cameras process that file internally as a JPEG or as a HEIF or even a TIFF file if you set it to that, and then delete the raw information. So what you're getting is essentially your camera is like a mini computer and it's processing the file and throwing away the raw file and giving you a processed file that's based purely on the settings of your camera. So the settings of your white balance and everything else. So what we like to do is we like to actually shoot in RAW mode. That's where we stop the camera from actually processing the file and we just save the raw data. It will still apply the algorithm of the camera to the file, and in certain software packages you can use those, but generally most software packages have their own algorithm which interprets the file a little differently, and we'll show that later when we do the demonstration. So a camera processed file has much less information than a raw file. So the raw file is way more flexible and far more forgiving when editing in post-production, and I'll demonstrate that later when we go through. So why shoot RAW? Firstly, because it is more flexible and forgiving. A camera process file is limited to the camera settings at the time of capture, whereas a RAW file will allow you to correct an exposure for up to 3 stops either side of correct. So if you've drastically overexposed or drastically underexposed, you can actually still salvage the file, and I'll demonstrate that as well. I say that, but it is always best practice to try and get your exposures right in camera. But if you do have a disaster, they are more likely to be salvageable if you're shooting RAW, whereas they'd be throwaway if you're shooting in JPEG. So a RAW file, for argument's sake, allows you to change the white balance of the file well after shooting it. So if you've set your white balance on your camera incorrectly for tungsten, for argument's sake, which means outdoors your daylight shots are going to be really, really blue, and you've saved it in JPEG, it's actually very, very difficult to fix. However, in a RAW file, you can just basically go into, as if you had your camera there, and change the setting to what it should have been, and it will work seamlessly. So it allows you to correct errors, but also gives you the flexibility to make a decision when you're viewing it on a color calibrated Benq monitor later in your workflow. Sorry. So a RAW file allows you to recover blown highlights. So if you're a wedding photographer and you're shooting a bride's dress and you're shooting in JPEG and you've overexposed, no amount of processing in the world will actually get any detail back in that white bride's dress. However, if you've shot in RAW, you'll easily be able to recover that. So same with shadows. If you've really underexposed, and I'm going to demonstrate this as well, you can actually really recover a lot of information from the shadows purely by shooting in RAW. And best of all, a RAW file allows you to process your output file in a higher bit depth. And for those of you that were in my last webinar in March, we talked about bit depth, and I've got that slide coming up just to repeat what it is. But essentially, greater bit depth means a lot more information in the file that relates to a lot more tonality. So you have a lot more room to move, and you'll avoid banding in skies and in subtle gradients. You know, when you see the stripes in your files where we get color change, you can avoid all of that by shooting in a higher bit depth or processing in a higher bit depth. So what is a RAW file? So a RAW file's not only camera specific, but also model specific. So a RAW file is really specific right down to the model of camera that you have. So I shoot a variety of cameras here, but when I upgraded my Canon cameras just recently, I had to update my software to bring in the new algorithm and the new codec for me to be able to process the RAW files from that camera, even though the extension is the same as that of another Canon camera. So some common RAW file types are IIQ, which is for phase 1, which is a medium format, CR2 and CR3, which are Canon files, NEF, which stands for Nikon Electronic File, ARW is Sony's, ORF is Olympus, and RAF is Fuji. So they're all completely different files. Now, if you have a Canon 1DX and it's a CR2, and you also have a 5D, which is a CR2, it is actually a completely different algorithm. So if you've got Photoshop set up and you haven't upgraded since they brought one of those cameras out, you won't be able to open it. And when I say upgraded, I'm not talking paid upgrades. I'm talking just updating, just doing your updates to keep it up to date with the latest cameras and so forth. A DNG file, which stands for digital negative, if captured by the camera, is also a RAW file. However, I've got my slides back the front. A RAW file can't be overwritten. What happens with a RAW file is we save a set of instructions on how we want it processed out, but you cannot actually overwrite a RAW file. You can delete it, of course, but you can't overwrite it. So a RAW file converted to DNG is not a RAW file in the true sense of the word. And there's a lot of people that believe that if they take their RAW file out of their camera and they put it in Adobe's DNG converter and convert it to a DNG, it is still a RAW file. Well, it is to a great extent, but what you're losing is all of the wonderful secret sauce that the camera manufacturers build into their cameras to make their cameras perform the way they do. Color science in a camera is very, very closely guarded. So when you take a RAW file and convert it to DNG, you're throwing away that camera science unless you embed the RAW file into the DNG. Now that will then double the file size. So my recommendation is not to convert to DNG. Leave the RAW file in its native form. That's the way it was created, and you can always refer back to that. Photoshop will open them regardless. Capture One will open them regardless. Affinity Pro will open them regardless. So there's no problems opening them. DNG was created many years ago as a standard, and it was going to be a standard file format for digital cameras. But because every digital camera is different, it can't work that way. So the point of converting to me is well, there is no point, to be perfectly honest, in my opinion. I'm sure there are others that would disagree with me. RAW converters simply save settings for a file with a recipe of all the adjustments that you have made. and that are applied to it when you process the file. And I'll demonstrate that later. So some of you, if you're using Lightroom or Photoshop, will have noticed that when you make changes to a raw file in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, that in your directory is another file with the same name with the extension Xmp. That Xmp file is all the settings, all the adjustments that you've made to the raw file, but it's actually made no change to the raw file. It just has the same name as that raw file. And if you open Photoshop or Lightroom again, it will refer to that file to see what adjustments that you've made, and it will apply them to your preview. I'll demonstrate that as well. If you delete that Xmp file, you've basically got your raw file straight out of camera without adjustments again. So that's just what I was explaining. I use Capture One. It doesn't actually use Xmp files like that. It uses a different setting file, but it does basically the same thing. It keeps a little recipe separate in a separate directory. So bit depth. So always work in the highest bit depth possible when you're outputting your raw files. So higher bit depth means more data, more tonality. 8-bit, which is your standard JPEG, or an 8-bit TIFF file, is only 256 levels of tone in each channel. And when I say channel, I'm talking about the red, green, and the blue channels. And it's those 3 channels combined that give us all the colours in the spectrum. Okay, so there's only 256 levels within each of those channels. However, each time we increase that by 1 bit, we double that data, effectively doubling our tonality. And there's just a quick little table, if you like, of how that bit depth increases the levels of data within the file. Now, it's not that you're necessarily going to see that data, but every time we make an adjustment to a file in Photoshop, we are throwing away a little bit of data. If we've only got 256 levels of data and we're throwing that away, it won't take long before we start to see posterization or banding, where we see those hard lines between tonal changes. If we have our file set at 16-bit, then that won't be an issue. Now, I must point out here that there are very few cameras that actually capture in 16-bit. Some capture in 12, some capture in 14. The Phase 1 does capture in 16-bit. However, all of them are better than capturing in 8-bit. And Photoshop just gives everything that's over 8-bit the title of 16-bit. So if you're looking for other bit depths, you won't see them. It's either 8 or 16 or 32 if you're doing HDR stuff, but that's a story for another day. So how does a RAW file work? So a RAW file is basically a digital camera sensor that has a mosaic filter over the top of it. It's what's called a Bayer pattern or a Bayer array. And if you look at the diagram on the screen, where we have in every cluster of four pixels, we have 2 green pixels, a blue and a red pixel. The reason there's more greens is because scientists have worked out that our eyes are more sensitive to green. Therefore, they have included that bias, if you like, in our camera sensors. Now, put very, very simply, when we take a photograph, it's actually taking a black and white photograph through these coloured mosaic filters. What it's doing, if you look on the right-hand side, the blue filter's letting the blue light through, the green's letting the green, and the red's letting the red light through. Now, where there's a blue pixel, it looks at the green pixels that are immediately next to it to work out what value it needs to give it in the green for green in that pixel, and it does the same for the red. So it's called interpolation. So where we have one color pixel, it makes a guesstimate of what that pixel should be in terms of the other color values and adds that into the data. And that's what our raw processing software does. So we need to process a file to make it usable, okay? Your camera can process the data based on your camera settings and delete the data that it doesn't use, but then you're stuck with the settings that you've decided on the day. So a better option is to use raw processing software to convert the data into a usable image file in post on a color accurate monitor, where you can actually see the changes that you're making in real time and make an assessment whether you need it to be lighter or darker, or you need to pull a highlight in or whatever. You can't really do that when you're just working with the camera and trying to process in camera. So when you view your raw file in your raw processor, it's not actually processing it at that stage. It's just doing a quick render for the screen only. And whenever we make a change, it's adjusting that screen render. We really have to process that file out in order to save all those settings in one file. Excuse me. So the process, I've just done a little diagram here. Here's a photograph I took down at Brighton Baths here in Melbourne, the sea baths, and that's a raw file. And I struggled today to find software that allowed me to do this, but fortunately I found some. If you look at that little square that I've zoomed in, that's what that file looks like as the raw data before I actually have put it into raw processing software. You can see there's obviously a bias to green. And if I zoom in closer, just in case you can't see it, you can see that there's little clusters of red, green and blue pixels. So every photo we take with our cameras and our phones and everything starts out like this. So that's the capture stage. So that's the first part of the process. Take a photograph, capture it, and keep that raw data so that we have a file that looks like this. Then we open it in our raw software. Now, what happens in the raw processing software, it looks at each of those pixels and it applies the values of the other colours to that same pixel that it didn't capture. So I'll go over what I said in the last slide. Where there's a blue, the software says, okay, there's a green one next to it. That must be what the value is. And it places it on the blue as well so that we get all three colour values on each pixel. And then we get something that looks a little bit more like a photograph. So that's processed straight out of camera with no colour correction applied. Then in our raw processing software, we can turn it into whatever we want to turn it into. So this has been edited entirely in Capture One. It hasn't actually hit Photoshop. I do use Photoshop. I don't use Lightroom. I use Capture One to process more raw files, but they do the same thing, essentially. So this has been edited. And if I don't require any more finishing touches to that, I can output that and it's ready to print. Okay, so I don't necessarily have to go into my processing software. So workflow. Many people think that working with raw files is slow and time consuming, but it doesn't have to be. And a good workflow can actually really speed things up. The great thing with good raw processing software like Capture One and Lightroom is that you can very, very quickly make edits to files without having to process them and wait for them. You don't have to open one file at a time, make your adjustments, save it, go to the next one. So you can make changes to a lot of files very, very quickly. You can also copy adjustments and apply them to multiple files. So if you've taken 20 photographs of exactly the same scene with the same lighting conditions, you don't need to adjust each one separately. You just copy and apply, and I'll show you that down the track when we do the demo. So choose a raw conversion software to suit your workflow, okay? So most cameras come with their own raw processing software and it does a fantastic job of providing you with a processed raw file. So if you're just processing one file at a time and you want to get the best out of it, you can just use the software that came along with your camera without having to spend any more money. The problem with that software, it's great at producing a processed image from your raw file, but they're not terribly good in terms of workflow. And as a professional photographer, I really need to be able to get my images in and out very, very quickly. So workflow for me is paramount. So what I'd suggest you do if you haven't shot RAW before, rather than jump in feet first, you can set your camera to do both. You can shoot RAW and you can shoot JPEG at the same time. If your camera has two cards, you can set it up to shoot the JPEGs to one, the RAW to the other, or put them all on the same card, it doesn't matter. That way, you've got the benefit of having instant access to your JPEGs, and if there's a file that you'd really like to do a bit of work on and play around with a bit, you've actually got a RAW file to do that. What you will find, I'm sure, is once you get the hang of working in the RAW format, that you'll stop shooting with the JPEGs altogether, because it's just as quick to run out a set of JPEGs from your RAW files anyway. But I'd suggest you do that as a starting point. So again, I'll reiterate, I perform all major edits and adjustments in my RAW converter. Now, my RAW converter is what we call a rendering engine. And when we are working in our rendering engine, we have all the data of the RAW file to play with. So we have data way past our overexposure point, and way beneath our underexposure point that would be lost in a TIFF file or a JPEG. But because it's there in the raw file, we can access that. And we can bring highlights in, bring shadows up, and we can get the best out of it. Because it's the raw data, the pixels haven't been created yet. We haven't actually processed the file out. So when we're finished in our raw software and we deliver our file out as a TIFF or a JPEG to be read in programs like Photoshop, we've actually given it the best possible data we can. So when it goes into Photoshop for final adjustments and edits and so forth, you know you've actually got a great file to start with. Only after doing all your major edits in your raw converter should you open it and adjust it in Photoshop. And I mentioned earlier students at university, a lot of them just see the raw converter as a step between Photoshop. So they'll take it out of the camera, do very little adjustment, process it to a TIFF file, put it into Photoshop, and then do all of their adjustments in Photoshop. That's really not the way it's meant to be designed. It's sort of the other way. Do everything you can in the raw converter and only do the minor finishing touches in Photoshop, with the exception, of course, of compositing and things like that, which is really editing pixels. So basically, perform edits that are not possible in your raw converter in Photoshop. So a good rule of thumb is if it can be done in your raw converter, that's the best place to be doing it. If it can't, leave it till later and do it in Photoshop after you've done all the edits that you can do in your raw software. So now let's pull up some files and do a bit of a demonstration. So I know a lot of people use Lightroom because it comes bundled with Photoshop. So I am going to disappoint you and tell you that I don't actually use Lightroom. I use a program called Capture One for a number of reasons. But if it's any consolation, they aren't too dissimilar. They look a little different. The main thing for you to take away is that Capture One and Lightroom pretty much have the same suite of tools. They're just in different places. Adobe Camera Raw, it uses the same processing engine as Lightroom. So essentially Lightroom and Photoshop use the same raw converter. They just use it through a different interface. So I'm going to demonstrate on Capture One tonight, and I'm going to demonstrate on Photoshop. And whatever I demonstrate, you will be able to find these tools quite easily in Lightroom as well. I don't use Lightroom, so I didn't really want to use it tonight and end up making lots of mistakes and a fool of myself. So I'll work with what I know. So this is Capture One, and I should have Photoshop open. I haven't. I'm just going to open Photoshop. I'll close my emails. You don't want to be reading those. And I'll open Photoshop. So I've got the same file, so we can actually see what the difference is. So there's a few things that are really, really good about shooting in RAW. Once Photoshop's opened, I'll fill you in on those. The first one is optics. Now, when I talk about optics, I'm talking about the ability, I'll just go back to Capture One. I'm talking about the ability to actually take the lens profile from the camera manufacturer or from the software manufacturer. I run a little Fujifilm camera and they're very smart. They include their lens profile within the software within the lens. So when you import it into Photoshop or into Capture One or Lightroom, it does the corrections for you. And these corrections are for fixing barrel distortion, vignetting where the center of the lens is brighter than the edges, chromatic aberrations where you get distortion of the light passing through on certain angles. And in Capture One, this has been shot on a phase 1 camera. I can also do diffraction camera. So it's automatically identified that I've used a Schneider Kreuznach lens here, macro lens, for this particular shot. If I go down to this one, which I've shot with a Canon, it automatically has picked up the lens. But I can add diffraction correction. I can get rid of purple fringing, which is, I don't know if any of you have seen that on the edges of your frames where you sort of get purple halos around things. We can get rid of all of that in a raw file because we've got all of the data and we can shift things around to make them work. So optics is a really, really good thing. But to give you an idea with this one here, I'll just turn this off to generic. And I don't know if you can see that, but I'll go back to that lens. And what it's doing, it's actually removing the distortion of the lens to make it correct. Now, funnily enough, sometimes I actually like the distortion. So it is a subjective thing here. But you know, you're getting the best out of the lens by playing with the optics. So that's one of the benefits first off. I generally don't go and look at that unless I have an issue. All right. So I have it by default to correct chromatic aberrations and hide distorted areas. So once I've brought files in, the first thing I do is, I'll go back to where I were. The first thing I do is I do my color correction. And I'll just put that back to where it was. So these were shot with tungsten. So I incorrectly had my white balance set to tungsten. When I say incorrectly, deliberately incorrectly, because it doesn't matter when we shoot in RAW. We can go back and change the white balance whenever we want. If this was a JPEG, I'd be pretty well stuffed. I'd really have a hard time getting the color to where I need it with such ease. That little card in the frame is an X-Rite color checker. I advise anyone that wants to produce really good color accurate work to go and invest in one of those, or even a little Kodak grey card or something like that, so that you can white balance your images. It's a very, very important part of it. And a lot of color correction is actually bad white balancing. And if you correct the white balancing, the color correction just snaps into place straight away. So it can reduce your workflow. So when I shoot a job in the studio, the first thing I do is I'm going to have to pull this down. I don't want to end up doing what I did before. Actually, I'll work in a smaller screen. Sorry, I've got the zoom controls covering a lot of my tools. So along the top here in Capture One, we have these tools. So if I click on the first one and I go to my grayscale on this chart, why is she not working? Go to the grayscale in this chart and click on it. It instantly balances that light. And when I say balance, I'm going to put the exposure warning on too. This red that we can see is where it's overexposed, and we've actually hit 255 in all channels, which means if it was a JPEG, there'd be absolutely nothing there anymore. It's blown out. In a RAW file, that's really simple for us to pull back in. But I can do a white balance, and then I can apply it to all of the shots that were taken in that same scene. So this was a job that I did for McCain Foods, photographing their French fries and things. And this is the way we work in the studio. So I've photographed that first file with a chart in it, purely as a reference chart that will stay with this job wherever it goes, so I can always refer back to it. I then quite simply copy it and paste it, and you should see that all the files underneath it are instantly color corrected. That to me is one of the most important tools of shooting RAW. I don't know if you can see how accurate that color is now, but I'm going to point out color accuracy is not always what you're after. So this is to give you a neutral starting point. We use colour to evoke emotion, to add feelings to a photograph. So it's important that we understand that this is bringing it to a neutral standpoint. If I was shooting portraiture, I might want to warm them up a little bit. This device also has a warming and cooling scale on it down here. So you can actually click on this, and I don't know if you can see that on your screen, but you can actually warm things up or cool them down and just go back to the grayscale to get them neutral. It is a known reference point. They're not cheap, they're over $100. And if you do buy one, don't touch the patches with your fingers, because the oil in your fingers will actually degrade the color and it will be useless. But they're made to exacting standards, and that's why they are expensive. But that's the first thing, white balancing, that I wanted to show you. Now, while we're on that, I'm just going to flick over into Photoshop, and I'm going to open up one of that same file just to show you how you would do that in Photoshop. So I just need to find where I have put them. Pretty sure I've got them on my desktop here. And I've got my raw files, so I'll take them here. I'll just take a few and I'll open them. Because they're raw files, they're not actually going to open in Photoshop. They're going to open in Adobe Camera Raw, which is a separate program that couples up with Photoshop. Incidentally, it's this same program that processes raw files in Lightroom, but just through a different interface. The engine at the back end of it is exactly the same. But what you will see here, if I go back to tungsten, if you select all of them, and I go back to tungsten, all right, when I make a change to my first one and have the other ones selected, it's going to correct them all. So it does exactly the same thing. So it's your white balancing tool that you're looking for, and it's in all the software. So it's generally an eyedropper. What you will notice is the files will look a little bit different, and that's nothing to do with white balancing. It's the way that Adobe's way of processing a file will vary a little bit differently from the camera manufacturers, will vary a little bit differently from Capture One. That's generally going to vary from software to software, but it is a good starting point for you to play with. So I'm not going to open those up at this point. I'll just minimize that. The next thing I have on my list is exposure. And I wanted to point out how easy it is to fix a file. Now, this red that we have here, this is a file out of my old 5DSR, which was with a, should tell me what lens it was. There we go. It was the 11 to 24. So it's a really wide lens. So I'm going to click Diffraction Correction to try and fix any imperfections caused by diffraction. Now, diffraction is when the light bends too far around and it doesn't hit the pixels direct on. So it spills across pixels and you get a bit of distortion happening. But what we have here is a file that was taken, and your camera meter will just give you an average. So if I look at that, I think my shadows are too dark, and I think my highlights are too bright because they're blown out. So wherever it's red, it's telling me that this shot is overexposed. So if I go back to the tab in here where we have the same tools that we saw in Adobe Camera Raw, you can see the histogram down the bottom here. We all see that down the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. That histogram tells me, when I look at this end here, how it's cut straight through, that these highlights are blown out. Now, I could pull my exposure in and bring that histogram in. Okay, so I've now brought my whole exposure down and I no longer have blown out skies. But what's happened? I've now got shadows that are too dark. Now I can do that, and then I can go to my shadow tool and just boost my shadows. So now I have a file where I can see into the shadows, but my highlights aren't blown out. And if you look at my histogram here, it's perfect. Everything is between the two lines. The shot's not perfect, but my histogram's perfect. So it means that I've got all the data in there. But I can actually work even more so. So if my sky's looking a bit muddy, I can add some white back into it. If my shadows are looking a bit, I'll pump my shadows up like a ridiculous amount, okay? You can see how much tone I can actually bring back into those shadow areas without using HDR, without doing anything special, just by using the raw file and all the data that's contained in that raw file. I can now, if my blacks in my shadows are now looking a little bit grey, I can actually tweak that and make them black by just bringing the black slider back in. So I've done that very, very quickly. Now, if this was a JPEG in Photoshop, I wouldn't be able to recover these. We'll pull a JPEG up of this and I'll show you in a moment. That would be lost forever. The shadows I could probably brighten, but they'd get very, very noisy because it's a processed file. But we can play around with this and do whatever we want. I can adjust the brightness, which is going to brighten it overall, but least of all the highlights. And I can increase the contrast or the saturation to make it look a little bit more realistic. I'll just pull those highlights in a little bit more. With my highlight slider, I can pull some more detail back into the sky. And if I do a before and after, now I'm explaining this to you, but realistically, I would have done this in about 3 or 4 seconds when I'm processing a job out. Now, as I've got other shots of tractors before it, if I highlight them and copy and paste, I can apply those same settings to the other files and they're done and might just need a little software tweak. It's that quick. And then if you look at a before and after, before and after. So exposure can be very, very easily manipulated in a raw file because we have so much information on either side of our histogram that's lost in a processed file. So I'm going to open Photoshop again. And what we'll do is I'm going to open one of those tractor images, but as a JPEG. So let's open the JPEG and have a look at what happens when we try and fix that in Post. It was the last one. That's the raw files. So we'll go to folder JPEGs, no adjustment. So if I shot this with my camera set to JPEG, this is what it would look like. Get rid of the cropping tool. All right, so how do I bring, actually is that the one we were working on? I think it is. I can try and pull my sky in, but it's just going to go muddy. All right, I can play around with my curves. All right. I could go in and I could do an adjustment layer through here to try and brighten shadows. All right, but it's a lot more work. Whereas in the raw software, I could do that very, very quickly. But what you'll notice is I cannot recover that sky. That sky is lost. And if I pull up my levels, hang on, that's our adjustment layer, I think. I'll delete that adjustment layer. If I go back here and I pull up my levels, you'll see the histogram is completely cut off there. Now, if I go back and pull in my, well, if I go up to the exposure tool, which I never use, so forgive me if it takes me a minute to find it. Okay, so I'm going to pull the exposure down. Have a look at the difference. Can you see that? That's when I try and pull the exposure down and try and pull some detail back into the sky. If I click OK on that and I bring my levels up, all it's done is pulled that straight line down because there is nothing past the end of my histogram. There is no more information for me to add to this file because I shot this in JPEG and the camera has thrown away all the other information. So it's only saved what's in there. So it's really, really difficult, I'll close this down, to make edits on a file if it's saved as JPEG. The beauty about having a raw file is that I can actually, I could navigate this machine, I can actually get it to look like that in a couple of swift strokes. Way less time consuming than what it would be if I was doing this in Photoshop. So that's exposure. Now, I've got a couple of other notations here. So the brightness tool that we have here will brighten the image overall. But if you notice down at the histogram down the bottom here, the brightness tool is actually not being as savage on my highlights. So it's not blowing my highlights out anywhere near as much because it's sort of taking the midtones and brightening them, but keeping the shadows and the highlights where they are. So our exposure, if anyone's taking notes, is adjusting the information from that file overall. And because it's a raw file, there's more information on either side of the histogram that we can actually take advantage of. Our contrast is changing the amount of tone in between to make it look more vibrant or less vibrant. Our brightness is to brighten the frame overall, but trying to keep our white point and our black point, or the brightest point and the darkest point of the frame where they are, just to brighten the thing overall. And then the high dynamic range tools are really self-explanatory. The highlight will pull the highlights in. The shadows will pull the shadows up. The white will make your whites white, because what can happen when we pull our highlights in, we can actually make our whites look muddy. So we want our clouds to be white, but we want to have some detail in there. So if I took the white down, the clouds look grayer. Okay, so I can adjust the whiteness of those, and I can adjust the blackness of the shadows as well. So that's taking the blackest point of the shadow and making it black. That's what we're doing here, whereas the shadow recovery is taking all of the shadow detail and making it brighter. So let's move on to curves and levels. We have the tools here, the same as what you have in Photoshop. And here we can bring in our highlights and our shadows, and they all work in a slightly different way. And then we have our curve tool, just like in Photoshop, where we can pull our midtones up and down. This is doing very, very similar to what our brightness tool is doing. This here is doing very similar to what our highlight recovery tool is doing, all right? But in a different way. So which one's going to work best? It really depends on the image. So we've talked highlight recovery tools. So in Lightroom and Capture One, we can also add adjustment layers. Now, I'm not sure if they're layers in Lightroom, but you can do a similar thing. So I could, for argument's sake, in the raw file, decide that I want to darken that sky a little bit more. And I've just pulled a layer over the top, so I can actually darken that sky a little bit more in the raw file. I can do that as a graduated linear adjustment. I can do it as a radial adjustment. Okay, the beauty is none of this is actually changing my raw file. I'm just writing a recipe of how I want to process my raw file when I come to process it. And if I'm not sure, I can just have a look and do a before and after and see what we've done to the file. Now, I'm really taking my time here, but it really doesn't take that long. And if I'm not happy with anything, I hit the reset. Make sure I've just got one selected, and it's gone back to normal. So that's adjustment layers. Now, adjustment layers can be painted on. So if you really need to get into a certain area and finesse it, like if I just wanted to get a brush in there and just paint, just brighten that wheel up a little bit, I can do that. So we can do all of that. A lot of the stuff that you would normally leave for Photoshop, you can do in your raw software, but when you do it in your raw software, you're not actually breaking down pixels because there's more information for it to draw on. I'm going to highlight or talk about the highlight and shadow recovery tools because I really want to demonstrate to you guys how powerful these tools are for working with your files. Now, if you're in Melbourne, you'll all recognise this. This is the St Kilda Pier. So I have taken this photograph, and just so that you can see, I'm going to show you the one that I've edited, which is the same file, all right? If I do the before and after, this is pitch black here, no detail. Now, you would just never recover that from a processed file. And that was done purely by, I'll just turn that off again so we're only seeing the files that I want to see. Purely by using those tools. So if we go back to our tool palette, and I'll open this up in Photoshop as well so that we can have a look and see, I can adjust my exposure. If I adjust my exposure, we lose the sky because we're moving all of the information up the histogram. Okay, so I might just brighten it a little bit there because I'm actually shooting directly into the sun. It's hidden behind this, this little veranda thing here. But what I can do now is I can actually pull the highlights in so that they're not blown out red, and then I can open up my shadows. So I'm really opening up my shadows, and then I can add my white point, pull my black point so that my shadows are there, go into my brightness, pull the brightness up a little bit. I might pull the highlights in a little bit more, maybe exposure. So this is all adjustments that you would make while you're looking at the file. And I can't stress strongly enough, I know that this evening sponsored by Benq. The reason we have quality monitors like the photographer's monitors from Benq is how can you realistically make adjustments to a file like this if what you're seeing on the screen isn't correct? So it's really important to have a good monitor. I'm working on my excuse me. I'm working on my little MacBook Pro, which is a laptop at the moment. I wouldn't use this screen for processing. I have a Benq one that I plug into it when I'm doing color accurate work, but it was just the easiest one for me to set up for this webinar tonight. But we can go in and we can play with all of these. So this is highlight recovery. So what we might do at St Kilda Cafe, I'll go over back to Photoshop and I'll open St Kilda Cafe and we'll try and do a similar thing in Photoshop. So I can find Photoshop folder. And it is St Kilda Cafe. It should be the really dark one. So we'll open that one. And these are very, very big files. So this camera is 150 megapixels. So the file's probably in RAW, the best part of a gig. So we've got a lot there. But we can do the same thing in Photoshop. Exposures, pull our highlights in, open our shadows. They don't have a brightness slider here. So we'd have to find something else that's going to enable us to do it. Probably a little bit more with the highlight, but you can see what I'm talking about. We can essentially do the same job in Photoshop as what I've done in Capture One. It is the tools that we're using to do this. Then there's other tools like vibrance that will increase the color, saturation that will increase the color, without going into any of the other tools. Incidentally, we talked about the optics in Capture One. It's the same here. Unfortunately, this one won't have them because it is a lens that's not supported by Photoshop, but all of your Canon and your Nikon and your Olympus lenses and all that are all supported. You would find the profile here. So it's all there in Photoshop and it's all there in Lightroom. So that's how we would do the same thing in Photoshop. The problem with Photoshop, it is not as good a workflow as Lightroom. So if you're doing lots and lots and lots of images, Lightroom or Capture One is the go. If you're doing just a smaller selection, Photoshop will do it for you perfectly. So where are we? So we have healing and cloning available in our images. So this is a shot again that was taken with the phase one, which is my preferred camera. And I was just going to show you how to retouch a dust spot out of this file, only to discover it was some of my spit on the screen. So I apologise for that. But let's have a look. Let's have a look at this file. I'll just work it very, very quickly. All right. I don't believe you need to spend hours on an image to make it work. You can work with it very, very quickly. So this is an image that I converted to black and white. If I open the other images, there is the black and white finished version there. So if I do the before and after, you can see. Now have a look here on the screen, this little bit of an umbrella that's sticking up behind the thing. It's completely gone. And this is all in the raw software. I'm still in Capture One. Sorry, I keep pulling it down because there's a menu across the top that's hiding tools from me. So, but I've done all of this in Capture One, and I could actually go back and have a look at the settings that I've done. So I've made an exposure adjustment. I've pulled some highlights in. I've pulled my blacks in a little bit to give it a little bit more punch in here. I've created some layers. I'll turn this off. And I'll repeat this for you with the file here so that you can see I've got that layer there. I'm not sure what I did with that layer. I don't know. And I've got the heel layer. This is the layer where I took out the top of the umbrella. So let's put this back as it was, and we'll open the one that hasn't been touched. Incidentally, it's the same raw file. We've got number 1 here and we've got number 2 here. I've just created what we call a new variant, and I'm not sure what Lightroom calls them, but it has another name for them, but it's the same thing. So we can duplicate that file. We're not actually creating 2 files, we're just viewing it twice with different settings. So you can compare. So in this shot here, the first thing I did was I converted to black and white. Now, converting to black and white is best done at the raw stage because you've got all the information to work with. Now, I'm just going to add a tool tab here, and this can be done in Lightroom as well as in Photoshop. But we'll go to my black and white exposure tool. Now, because there's not a lot of colour in here, it's just going to take out the colour. But the water had a greeny tinge to it. So if I go on the green slider, it's going to adjust that water, all right? The sky's got a bit of a blue tinge, so I can bring some detail back into the sky to play with it. Now, there's a couple of other tools that we're going to play with here as well to show you what we're doing. If I go back to my main thing, I can use the highlight recovery tool to bring in some highlight detail. I can open the shadows a little bit. I can bring in a little bit of black. I could add, and I'm not copying the other image, I'm just going hell for leather here. I could add an adjustment layer of a vignette, which is this one here. And I could drag that down over the top and just slightly reduce the exposure on the top of the file. I could then increase, if I go back to the main layer, I could increase the contrast, give it a little bit more punch. Then we have these tools called clarity. Now, clarity is localized contrast. So it's contrasting at a pixel level, not overall. And in Capture One, there's 2. So one does fine detail and one does broader detail. So we just slide that up and you can see what's happening to the file. It's making it a little bit more punchy. If anyone uses Silver Effects to do black and white conversion, it does a lot of stuff with the clarity to bring out texture and detail. And there's different ways, so we can play with that. And then I need to do an adjustment layer, a healing layer. So I'll just go in close to that area. We'll wait for it to render. It should be sharp. And if I go here to the little Band-Aid, same as in Photoshop, and I just paint over that, it should automatically, I'll just wait for it to render. Okay, it's automatically just taken another bit of fence and placed it over the top. It's that easy to retouch things out in the raw file. Now remember, this hasn't touched Photoshop yet. This is a raw file. When I output it, it will be 16-bit. So I'm not sure how the healing brush works in Lightroom, but you can do it in Lightroom. I'm not sure you can in Adobe Camera Raw. That's one of the benefits of going over to Lightroom. But let's open that same file in Photoshop and just try and do some similar things to it in Photoshop. So we'll open that up. And there is a black and white tab, I believe, in here. Is it basic? As I said, I don't actually use this, and they've changed the interface since the last time I looked at it, but there is a black and white tool. Mixing. Waiting. No, I don't know where it is, guys. I'm sorry. Oh, here we go. It's right there at the top, black and white. You just have to know where to look up here. So now it's black and white, and you'll see that we have all of the color sliders still of a black and white color mixer there. So we have auto, we can do an auto, but I can go to the greens and you'll see it's having the same effect on the water. We can go to the blues play around, try and get a bit more texture out of the sky. I can then go back to my basic editing and play with the exposure. So it can all be done. Like I said, most raw software applications have the ability to do this. You just need to know where to look for them. And I apologise, I'm not familiar with Photoshop. I do all of my raw processing in Capture One. So we'll go done. So we'll go out of that. So what I want to show you is, if I, very, very quickly, if I just open the recent one that we did. So I'll go back to Capture One. You can see, I don't know if you can see here on the screen, but I'll just zoom in. You can see all of the files that I've opened have these little XMP files next to them. These little XMP files. The ones that I've opened in Photoshop, that is. So if I pull that back out again, and if you look at the one that we did up the top here of Brighton Pier, there's an XMP file there. So if I open that again, it will come back in with the adjustments that we made the last time I opened it, when I just showed you. However, if I go done and I go File, Open, and I delete that file, I might have to get out of it just into the folder. Hang on a minute. I'll get out into the folder. So that is the Photoshop file that has all of the settings. Now I've just got to find that folder. There we go. So here is the XMP file. I will just, for the sake of this exercise, I won't delete it, I'll just move it. So I'm just going to move it to here. And I'll go back into Photoshop and I'll go File, Open, and I'll click on the same raw file. And it's back to the state it was before I did anything. Now, if I take that raw file, that XMP file, sorry, and I drop it back in there again, and we do the same thing. I open it now, it'll be black and white again. So that is the recipe that's containing all of our adjustments. Now, in this case, it's just black and white that we've done, but every single thing that you've done to your file is stored in that XMP file. And in Lightroom and in Photoshop, it will look for that file that should be in the same folder as the file that you're opening in order to refer to those adjustments. Now, if you're not happy with the adjustments, you can go back and do a reset here by holding the Option key down. Nope, doesn't do that anymore. Just go to the folder and delete the XMP file. In Capture One, it works a little differently. If I go down to my Capture One session, which will be down in here, and I go to my capture folder, you'll notice there is no XMP files here, but there is a folder called Capture One. And if I click on that, there is a folder with my settings. So it's got Capture One, COS is Capture One settings, and a cache of my thumbnails. So it keeps them out of the way, and Capture One will refer to that folder for the adjustments. And just like the XMP file folder, if I delete that folder, then all the settings are gone as well. All right, so we'll get to the final stage of it. So in these raw converters, what you can do is you can also rotate and crop, and you can do keystoning. Now, I'll just show you. So I photograph a painting for a local artist, and as you'll see, if I reset them back to where they were, there's been a couple of little changes in the file. So my workflow would be, I'm shooting in the studio, I would get the light right. First thing I'm going to do is get my white balance. I'm going to go in here, I'm going to go on one of the grey. Anything in here is fine to click on, but I generally suggest you aim for a mid-tone grey, unless you're getting a colour casting of highlights. You can go for your white or your lighter grey. I'm now going to apply that setting to the other files. So it's now changed. Hang on. That was very silly of me. I copied the previous adjustments from the previous file. So I now have this file white balanced. So I'll bring it in. So what I can do in here very, very quickly, if I want to output this, and I will output it, is I will run that on the edge there to make it straight, first of all. Now, Lightroom does this as well, just a little differently. It's called keystoning. If I drag these corners to the corner of the file, now this doesn't have to be a painting. You could have photographed a city building and decided that it's crooked and you want to straighten it. Architectural photographers can use this all the time. If you don't have a tilt shift lens to straighten your subjects, you can fix it later in here. It's not going to be as good as a tilt shift lens, but it will do the job. I've now just made sure that's perfectly square. Now, it is actually incredibly hard to get things perfectly square in camera. Now I'm on the crop tool. I'm just going to bring this crop down into the file. And if I go back to hand tool, that is now my file. I've got a little bit too much on the edge here. I've got it. Now, the last part of the whole process is to actually output the file. So to output the file, they all work a little differently, and we'll do one in here and we'll do one in Photoshop. But I have recipes that I've created here that I use a lot. So I'm going to process this out as an Adobe RGB 16-bit TIFF. Whoops, you can see that just there. Okay, so we will that back here. So I'll tick that and I'm going to tell it to open it in Photoshop. So this is the process recipes parameters. It's going to be a TIFF, 16-bit, uncompressed, with a color space of Adobe RGB because we want this for printing, not for the web. sRGB is for the web. I want it at 300 DPI and I want it 100%. I want it to be the biggest that you know, the size that it was when it came out of the camera. And I just hit on the process tab and it will open this processed file in Photoshop. You'll notice that I've got 16-bit here. If you remember earlier in the talk, I said 16-bit gives us a lot more information to work with. So if I'm opening this file in Photoshop straight away, I now have a beautiful reproduction of my client's painting. And if we get into 100%, we can see the texture of the canvas in there. It's all looking good. If I go here, image mode, it's in 16. Image mode, it's in 16-bit. So I've got all the possible data that I need. If I pull up my levels, my histogram is perfect. I've got no blown highlights, no blocked up shadows. That file is good to go to the client. I don't need to actually do anything to it in Photoshop, unless there were other tweaks that the client wanted me to do. So to do that same thing in Photoshop, what did we call that file? Victoria Uncorked and GB01. So I'm going to do exactly the same process I just did there in Photoshop. Now, there was no adjustments because that was shot in a controlled studio environment under studio lighting behind me here, where I measured everything accurately, plugged into a Benq monitor and made assessments and made adjustments so that I made sure I got it right in camera. And, you know, you can't underestimate how important that is. So we'll go back and we will open those two files and then I'll go back and finish the presentation and we'll open it up to some questions. So if we grab that and GB, these files are all over the place because they're from different jobs, but normally they'd be a lot more organized than this. So it's going to open in oh, hang on. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to select both of them. Go into here. I'll grab my white balance tool and I'll do that. I don't know if any of you noticed that it was out of focus for a little while and then it popped in. That's because Photoshop is actually making a render for the screen. This is not yet a file that looks like that. This is what it's going to look like when we process it. So the process recipe for Adobe Camera Raw is in here. I've already got it set to all those things that we had it set to in Capture One. Adobe, 16-bit, default, 151 megapixels, 300 DPI, no sharpening. I could open it as a smart object, but I don't use Adobe Camera Raw, so I won't go down there. Now, we can also go to, so I've done the white balance. I can now tick off the white, tick off that one. Zoom out again. And if I go to geometry, I can actually change the, don't know how to do it properly because I don't use it, but I can actually go in here and correct the distortion, get it perfectly square, and I can also do a crop in here as well. I haven't used this for so long. The interface has completely changed since the last time I used it. So I might save cropping for Photoshop because I think that's going to be easier. But if we now click on here, this is how it's going to be processed. So what I need to do now is go open, and it will open this file in Photoshop. There's one big difference between Photoshop and between Lightroom and Capture One is we need to save this file when we're finished. So we'll just wait for it to open up, and I could go in here and use my crop tool. As I said, I do use Photoshop for some editing. So I'll just go ratio because I don't want to, and then I'll crop it down here. I don't know what I'm doing wrong here. Ratio, it's hiding my tools, sorry. So I can go through and I can crop it in here. In Lightroom, you can crop it like you can in Capture One. You can also do it in Photoshop, but because I don't use it, I'm not familiar with it. But the important part of the exercise here is that you understand what these tools are doing and you find them in your own preferred software. So if I could sum up before we go back to the presentation, a good workflow is to bring your image into your RAW processor, get your white balance right first, then play around with the exposure, the highlight, and the adjustments for your midtones and your shadows and everything. Crop it the way you'd like it, add some clarity or some sharpening, and then output it. It's as simple as that. If you want to do more to it, like I retouched out the top of that umbrella, you can do things like that. At the end of the day, essentially anything that you can do to your file in your RAW processor, you should be doing it there, not in Photoshop later. So the best practice is to do whatever you can in your RAW processor and save the fine tuning for Photoshop. So I'm just going to wind that up there. I'm going to go back into the presentation and just go into the last couple of pages, and then we'll open it up for questions. So where is play? So we've had our demonstration, and so yes, the importance of a color managed monitor. So it's not only the fact that it's viewing colors accurately, it also needs to be able to reproduce the color that we have in our files. So you'll notice when I said we're going to print, it's Adobe RGB, these Benq monitors will actually display 99% of the color that's in the file. That's really important because if your monitor is only displaying sRGB, you're making adjustments to color in your RAW processor that you can't actually see on your monitor. It's really important that you can see them, particularly when we're bringing in highlights and hues and saturations. We want to see exactly what's happening to the file. And if your monitor can't display that, then you're not going to see it. They're factory calibrated, so they're a very, very high standard. They're hardware calibrated. Now, the difference between hardware calibration and software calibration is that we're actually calibrating the hardware inside of the monitor. we're adjusting what's called the lookup tables inside the monitor to make sure that it's working accurately. And in layman's terms, if your monitor is not hardware calibrated, you're adjusting the lookup tables of the signal that's being sent to the monitor on your computer, which is not as good as actually adjusting the monitor in its own right. So they're uniform from corner to corner. It has a viewing hood. If you can see that hood around the monitor, absolutely imperative if you're working in a room that has lights or a window or anything, to keep unwanted light from straying onto your screen and affecting the way you see things. It has a hotkey puck, which is a very, very easy dial to work on things. It has a black and white mode, so you can quickly look by pushing a button to see what that image will look like in black and white before you go to the trouble of processing it. And if you have one that's got C on the end of the model name, it means it has a USB-C connection, which means if you've got a laptop like my MacBook Pro here, I can plug one cable into the monitor and it will power my computer, and it will do the color management, the audio, it will do everything that I need it to do. And they're verified by two of the most respected color companies in the world. And there's the range, the lineup of the photographer monitors. I've taken the prices out because I'm not sure what they are charging, but they're all on their website if you need further information. Now, just to close before we hand over into questions, I do fine art quality printing. If any of you would like to print your work, I'm offering a 15% off coupon code. If you go to my website address, which is just above it, the alteredimages.com fine art printing, and enter the BenQ21 code in, up until the 30th of September, I'll be doing those prints for you at 15% off. So if after tonight you decide you've got some masterpieces that you'd like to have printed, then that's an offer for you guys there. And remember, it's not a photograph unless it's printed. There's more images sitting on computer hard drives now that'll never see the light of day. If you're proud of it, you should print it. And I'll hand it over to questions, and I'll actually, can you see me on the screen at all, Grace?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, that's probably not a good thing, but I'll shut this down and go back to just not sharing. And we'll go into questions. Sorry, I'm struggling with all this technology. So I'll stop sharing and I'm back. All right. So do we have any questions, Grace?
Yes, so we've got a few. Richard asked several programs that you may wish to use within the process, such as DxO for prime noise reduction outputs in TIFF or DNG, or Topaz for sharpening or noise reduction will only output adjusted files in TIFF. How good is TIFF for retaining information, or should any program which only outputs in TIFF or DNG only would be used at the end of the process? That was a very long question.
Okay. All right. So let's go back. So all of these programs work quite well. I have some Topaz plugins. I used to use a thing called Noise Ninja to reduce the noise. You can do noise reduction in your raw processor. Now, the thing with noise is generally generated for two reasons, okay? One is that your sensor is hot because your exposure is very long. And if you don't have long exposure noise reduction switched on in your camera, your files will be very, very noisy. So if you're doing long exposure, make sure you've got noise reduction switched on. If you are shooting a raw file and you're not actually addressing the exposure in the raw processor and you bring it into Photoshop as a TIFF, when you try and extract information out of your file, noise is one of the byproducts. So pulling shadow detail out is where you're going to find the noise predominantly. So if you're finding noise in your shadows, you'd be much better processing it out in your raw processor and bringing the detail out of the shadows there than trying to process it out of a TIFF file later on. And if any of you were on my last workshop, we talked about the distribution of the data within the file, and unfortunately the shadow areas of your file have the least amount of information. So when we try and pull information from a processed file, there's no information that can be pulled out. So the result is noise. Whereas if we do that in the raw processor, as I've demonstrated, we can pull stuff out like that. That shot of the St Kilda Cafe on the St Kilda Pier, if I zoomed right in and showed you there's absolutely no noise, and I've pulled that in maybe 3 or 4 stops. So, so the way you process your files can minimise the noise. If after doing lots of treatment to your file, you're finding that there is noise, then by all means, stuff like the DxO, I don't remember what the noise, part of the Nick software suite there, noise reduction works. The Topaz one works. I use another one by Imaginomic. They all work, but they generally will soften the file as well.
Okay, so next question from Joe. Is there an advantage of Capture One over ACR?
Look, I don't want to sound negative, but in my opinion, nothing comes close to Capture One for processing a raw file. Nothing. That's why I use it. Many years ago, I had some issues. However, it's what you need. You know, like to use Capture One, you have to actually outlay extra money, whereas you get Lightroom included in your Photoshop package. So it's up for you. If you want to really get the best out of your files and extract every bit of detail, I would suggest it's money well spent. I'm not advocating that you rush out and buy it. You can download a trial and have a play with it. Some people like it, some people don't. One of my closest friends has been a Lightroom advocate for years and years and years, and he wouldn't hear otherwise. He's just recently changed to Capture One and can't understand why he didn't do it earlier. He's sold. That said, Lightroom comes free with Photoshop. Capture One will not replace Photoshop. It will replace Lightroom. So I could not live without Photoshop. Now, if you look at it this way, you get Lightroom for free with Photoshop. So if Lightroom is filling your needs, then there's probably no need to look further. If you're finding it frustrating and it's not doing what you want, download a trial of Capture One from phase1.com and have a play and see what you think.
And Luke asked, what profile do you edit with in these tools?
What profile? Well, you don't edit with a profile. You output to a profile. So we're editing the raw data, the recipe that we output to. So I could output to any profile. So, but generally I work in Adobe RGB. So some people work in ProPhoto RGB. ProPhoto RGB is actually a bigger space than Adobe RGB, but there's nothing that can reproduce it. So it's a little bit like what I was saying about adjusting a file, an Adobe RGB file on an sRGB monitor, where we're making adjustments to colours we can't see. If we're working on a Benq monitor in an Adobe RGB workflow, and we're working in a ProPhoto RGB workflow, the monitor can't display the colours. We can't print the colours. So when we're making adjustments, we're actually making adjustments to colours that we can't actually see and make an assessment of the changes we're making. Now, I use ProPhoto RGB for certain conversions because it can help, but that's probably a little bit too complex, but you can actually process out to Adobe to ProPhoto RGB and then convert to Adobe RGB in Photoshop and retain some colour that you know, that you possibly couldn't if you just did it straight into Adobe RGB.
Miranda asked, your color checker has a few different shades of grey. What makes you choose one over the other? Or
basically exposure. So I generally choose from the middle. But if I'm finding that I have a strong cast in my shadows, I might choose a darker one. If I've got a cast in my highlights, I might choose one. But that chart can also be used for profiling your camera. There's a free software download that if you have one of these charts, you can actually write a custom profile for your camera. And that's why all the other colours are there as well.
And Deb asked, you spoke about camera settings as relevant. Can you explain what settings are important, and can she send her raw files to the printer?
Okay, so sending your raw files to a printer is probably a no-no because you're then relying on the printer to basically decide what he thinks is the best way to print that file. Now, photography is very subjective. You can get 5 photographers in a room that all disagree about the same photograph. So I wouldn't advise sending a raw file unless you have a reference of how you want it printed. Camera settings are always important on a camera. Okay, so we use the camera settings to get the best out of the camera in the situation that we're photographing. My reference to camera settings is that if you're shooting as a TIFF or a JPEG, when you shoot, your camera is actually capturing a raw file, but behind the scenes, without you doing anything, it's processing it to a JPEG, and it's processing it based on the settings in your camera. So if you've got contrast settings set in your camera, you've got film style set in your camera, you've got a white balance set in your camera, that's how the JPEG is going to be processed out. And there is no return from that without a lot of mucking around in Photoshop. If you're shooting with all of those same settings in RAW, you can simply go in and say, well, hang on, that's the wrong white balance for that photograph. I will change it. And you can just click on it and change it, and it will change it instantly. If you think, okay, I shouldn't have applied that contrast to this file, you just go in and you turn it off or adjust the contrast. You can't do that with the JPEG because it's all locked into that process. So if you could think of your camera as being the recipe in which you're processing the file. So whatever settings you have set on your camera, that's how the file will be processed. Whereas if you're using the RAW, it's not processing the file, it's stopping it at the RAW, and we're going to look at it on a screen and decide how we'll process it later.
And Ben asked, how do you ensure calibration accuracy between 2 or more monitors, specifically Benq SW271?
If you have more than one of them, is that the question? If we have more than one monitor?
Yeah, 2 or more monitors.
How do I ensure? Just make sure that you have, look, there's a whole lot in that, and we're going to do a workshop, I believe, or a webinar down the track on monitor calibration. But the way that you view your monitor is largely influenced by its surroundings. And it's quite bizarre that you can have 2 monitors side by side and they look different purely by what you've got on the screen. And I see this in my raw processing software. If I have the same file up twice, because the left-hand side of the file is a different tone to the right-hand side, they look completely different, when in actual fact, they're identical. If you want more information on that, look up color constancy on the website. It's quite interesting on the tricks your mind plays on you. Now, all of that aside, to have them looking as close as possible, we just simply need to calibrate them to exactly the same settings. So put them side by side and have them calibrated to identical settings. Now, these monitors are certified. They've been calibrated in the factory to a standard. So if we're calibrating to the same settings, they should look pretty good side by side. The only way to be 100% sure is to get rid of whatever screen, coloured screen you have on it or picture you have on your screen, and go just to a neutral grey and put them side by side so there's no variation from the left and right. Because if, for argument's sake, you had a vignette where the left-hand side of your screen was white and it was going to a dark grey on the right-hand side, and you had that on the next monitor as well, they are going to look so different to each other because the white part of the monitor on the right is up against the black part of the monitor on the left, and it's playing tricks with your mind, when in actual fact they're identical.
And Duncan asked, does it matter what color space is set in the camera if shooting RAW?
No, it doesn't. So this is one of the settings that is controlled by the camera if you're processing in the camera. So if you're shooting JPEG and it's set to sRGB, your JPEG will come out with sRGB. You don't actually apply a color balance or a profile to a RAW file until you process it out. So in that recipe that I showed you in both Capture One and in Photoshop, you'll see that I had selected Adobe RGB. At that point, if I set it to sRGB, the files that I processed would be in that color space. I could also set it to Pro Photo RGB and it would process them in those. So when we're processing a RAW file, we determine what color space we're outputting to when we output.
And Sally asks, how would you use your color checker card when you're shooting a landscape scene in natural light?
I don't generally use it for a landscape scene. So daylight doesn't change too much. You know, and a little bit of experience, you will know roughly what color temperature range you need to apply. So in a landscape environment, if I'm not sure, I just hold it out at arm's length in front of the camera, because the lighting that's illuminating the chart is the same one that's illuminating the landscape in the distance. It's the same color temperature. So you can use it like that.
Yeah. And Mesha asked, with her camera, Sony mirrorless, has the option for uncompressed or compressed RAW in camera settings. What is the difference, and is the compressed version good enough?
Okay, so there's a couple of things, and I've just noticed I've just changed to Canon R5s, and they have a compressed RAW as well. So what compression does is exactly what it sounds. It's making the files that it writes to the card much smaller. Now, I have done some research on the Canon. I can't vouch for the Sony, but experts are saying that they cannot see any visible difference between the files. So there's two forms of compression. So there's what we call lossless compression and lossy compression. Now, lossless compression is where it has an algorithm that becomes broader and broader to take in more variations in tone and give them the same value. Therefore, it's actually degrading your file. So you're losing quality. And what I mean by that, because it probably sounded a bit geeky, is if you imagine you've got a piece of white paper and you've got it on a table and the light from the window is spilling across it. The paper's white, but the right-hand side of the paper is a few shades darker than the left-hand side because it's closer to the light. In JPEG compression or a lossy compression, the more we compress it, the less difference there will be from the left to the right-hand side of the page. So if we go to maximum compression, it's going to give that whole page the same digital tonal value. Whereas if we have a lossless compression, it doesn't do that. So to make the file smaller in a lossy compression, we're actually losing tonality. In a lossless compression, we're not. So an LZW compression of a TIFF file out of Photoshop is what we call lossless. So it is not doing any damage to the file. So if you can find out whether your RAW files are a lossless or a lossy compression, that will tell you the difference. If they're lossless, try it. Do a couple of frames and try it. All it's really going to do for you is save you space on your card. The other issue is that that not all RAW converters can read compressed RAW files. So that can be a problem. So you'd need to check that your RAW converter will actually read them as well.
And Ralph asks, I believe you can create a 32-bit depth image. How do you do this?
That's done. Yeah, that's done through HDR, so high dynamic range. So trying to expand the high dynamic range of the file. So when you go into Photoshop and you take, let's say you've set up on a tripod and you're photographing an interior of the house. So you've photographed to expose for what's outside the windows, right through to the shadows within the house. And let's say you've got 5 photographs. When you go into the high HDR tool, high dynamic range tool in Photoshop, and you blend them all together, it gives you a 32-bit file. And that 32-bit file gives you a lot more tonality to play with, but when you save it, it converts it back to 16-bit. So that's how you'd make a 32-bit file.
Joe asked, is the new Canon Core as good as RAW?
Is the new what?
Canon,
sorry?
I think RAW? I think you meant to type RAW, not Canon Core.
As good as?
RAW.
Sorry, I'm not getting it. Is the new Canon RAW, the CR3, as good as the old Canon RAW CR2? Is that what we're asking?
If you open the Q&A chat icon down the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would help, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so can you see?
Compressed. No, I'd say what he's talking about is compressed RAW.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so I have done a couple of tests and I can't see the difference. I haven't come across a situation yet where I think, oh, geez, I wish I hadn't have compressed that raw. That said, I don't do it very often. I've got plenty of cards, so I shoot uncompressed. As a professional, we do everything to try and limit any risk with a file, and anything that could cause a risk, we don't. But I have heard glowing reports about it from people overseas that have done the tests and worked with it and said it's just fantastic. What I have noticed is the higher the ISO, the less compression. So if you're shooting at 100 ISO, you can really compress them. If you're shooting on really high ISOs, because there's a lot more noise, they don't compress anywhere near as much. So the compression rate will depend on the ISO. All right, Donna, I can see it.
Yeah.
So when I use Photoshop, my raw images automatically opens in Camera Raw first. So how does your raw image open in Capture One if I want to use Capture One and not Camera Raw? Okay, so if you were using Capture One, there's a workflow where you would import the file into a Capture One session. If you the way you do it in Capture One is you would actually open Capture One and then open the file. If you want your raw files to open up in Capture One by default, when you double click on them, you just need to go into your properties. Now on a Mac, you go right click or control click and select Get Info and go down and say Open with Capture One and then apply to all files. I, for the life of me, can't remember how to do it on a PC because I haven't used a PC for many, many years, but that's how you do it. It's a very simple process. Yes, if you're interested, Marie, in playing around with Capture One, if you go to the Phase One YouTube channel, there's a heap of video tutorials to show you how to do it. And if you're a Lightroom user, there's even a tutorial on how you can import your Lightroom catalogs into Capture One. Right, so Mesha, my raw files often look quite dark when I first open in Lightroom. Is this okay, or should they look pretty close to the right exposure even before processing? All right, if they're looking too dark, Mesha, you're probably underexposing a little bit. So I would have a look at the meter in your camera or look at how you're exposing. We did a thing, if you have a look at the webinar that I did in March. Is it still online, Grace? Can they still view that?
Yes. So
yeah, if you have a look at that one, yep. Okay, we actually talk about shooting to the right, and that's being able to read the histogram on the back of your camera. So rather than looking at a picture on the back of your camera, we look at the histogram because that's really going to tell us what the exposure's like. And shooting to the right is just making sure you push all that information in the histogram as far to the right as possible, irrespective of how the photo looks on the back of your camera, without the point of pushing it past that, if that makes sense. So we don't want to have a whole lot of blank space on the right-hand side of the histogram because that means your file will be underexposed. The beauty is if you're shooting RAW is that you can just get your exposure slider and hopefully you don't have to slide it too far to get it looking right. Now, if you're having to slide it and if you look at the slider and it says it's 3 or more stops, I'd perhaps get your camera serviced and get your light meter checked because that could be a problem.
So Greg asked,
okay,
Lumina AI compared to Capture One or Lightroom or Photoshop?
Okay, so I don't really know, and it's stupid because I actually bought it because it offered all this stuff, and then I looked at it and I thought it's just learning a whole new workflow, which I wasn't prepared to do. I really can't give you an honest answer on that, Greg. The videos certainly impressed me enough to buy a pre-release copy of it, but I've never actually opened it and looked at it. I suggest, look, there's lots of competition to Capture One and Lightroom out there. Corel have a RAW processor. There's lots of other smaller companies that produce RAW processors. DxO do. For me, Capture One provides me with the best workflow, and I have no need to actually, look for anything else, as does Lightroom for a lot of other people or Photoshop. So if they're not doing what you want them to do, then maybe you could look at things, look at other applications. Now, what I believe Luminar does do is it replaces skies and things like that very easily. I'm a bit of a purist in that sense. I like to photograph what I see. I don't introduce other objects into my photos. But for those that want to do that, I believe that's a good option. But don't overlook the new neural filters in Photoshop because they are amazing. They do some amazing things. It's neural filters. You have to download them, but it's included in Photoshop, and they do some. You can take someone who isn't smiling in a photo and make them smile and stuff like that. It's really quite bizarre. It's using all this AI technology, which is what Luminar's using as well, which is artificial intelligence. So the best thing would be, Greg, to just, if you've bought it, play with it, see what you think. If you haven't bought it, download a trial version.
And Deb asked if she was to send a file to print, I presume to send it as a TIFF file.
Yeah, you can send it as a TIFF. So if Deb's still online and watching, if you go to my website, there is a section under Fine Art Printing on file preparation. I can print JPEG, TIFF, PSD, pretty much anything you give me. But a 16-bit TIFF gives us more room to move and less chance of banding and so forth. So when you do this online, you will be directed to a file uploader. You just drag your file in. As long as it's under 2 gig, it will come to me and I can print it from there. But yeah, TIFF is my preferred for photographs, or PSDs.
And Duncan asks, when exporting an output file before printing, are all those settings stored in the sidecar file, XMP or Capture One style?
When exporting an output file before printing, are all those settings stored? Okay, so when you're exporting or outputting a file, you're actually applying all those settings to the file. So it's processed with those settings in place. When you go back to your raw conversion software, it has retained all those settings with the raw file. So you could make adjustments to them, yes. But the file that you output, okay, has had them applied. So it's like it's been flattened and applied to it, and it's a finished file. A C1 style is different to a recipe, I've got to say, a Capture One style. Capture One style is a set of preset adjustments to give you a certain effect. But the same thing, it would if you've applied it to the raw file in Capture One, you put that session away for 5 years, you come back to it, open Capture One, open that raw file, it's exactly how you left it with all those things applied to the recipe. So you can just change them and adjust them and update them and do what you want.
And Diane, does Affinity process raw photos?
It does. I'm not sure to what level. I think if you type in Affinity Raw Camera Support or Camera Raw Support, it gives you a list of the cameras, so you can have a look at what's available there. The reason a lot of people are going to programs like Affinity, I actually bought it, not that I use it, I bought it because I believe that we have to have an option out there that we can own outright. I'm not that far off retirement. And I don't want to be paying Adobe for the rest of my life so that I can look at my photographs, because the only way you can use Adobe software is to subscribe. And you don't, with Affinity, you buy it once for a very reasonable price and you own it outright. So and Capture One the same. You can buy Capture One and own it outright. And if you have the same camera, there is no need to upgrade and you can access your files for the rest of your life. So that's my thought. I have Affinity. A friend of mine retired a few years ago and he was of the same feeling, and he bought Affinity and has migrated over to it, and he's very pleased with it. But what camera files it supports, I'm not sure. But look, they're trying to compete with Photoshop, so I'm sure that they will be doing their best to get as many cameras in there as possible.
Last question from Greg. I see Capture One offers styles with its purchases. What is the benefit of buying styles?
Okay, the benefit of buying styles, it's a preset. It's like buying Lightroom presets. So if you if you do landscapes, you can buy these presets that do certain things to the files with the click of a button. I don't use them personally. I know some people that do, but you can also create your own styles. It's a little bit like having Photoshop and then buying silver effects to do your black and white when you can actually comfortably do them all in Photoshop yourself if you know how to do it. It's that sort of thing. So I've seen some very reasonably priced styles, and I've seen some that were more expensive than Capture One itself, but I personally don't use them.
Okay, that's it for the questions. We got through every single one.
All right. Beautiful. So does that mean we've still got 99 people online? Is that correct?
At the
no,
moment,
that's the chat. We've got 69 people online still. Yeah, okay. So I think that's the end, isn't it, really? We've covered everything.
Yes.
We've got no more questions. So thank you, Benq.
No worries. Thank you, Ian.
So thank you, Benq, for making this evening possible. I hope those of you that are still there did get something out of it, even if you've got one or two tips that's going to improve your photography. It's time well spent. I've always believed if you go to a seminar and you can walk away with one good tip, then you've learned something. So, so thanks for joining us. Keep your eyes open for more wonderful Benq webinars from other photographers, and it's a good, efficient way of learning and improving your craft. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ian. We hope everyone has enjoyed this informative session. So, and don't forget to fill out our survey at the end of this webinar.
No worries. Thanks, Grace. And I might speak to you tomorrow. Hey.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.